Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip is a bit of, I hope, unique twist on the appraisal gap stipulation. This is February 2022. Took me a minute there. And in the metro Atlanta area, we are still in an extremely hot market or fast market, meaning there is less inventory than there are buyers. And so there are a lot of strategies that buyers are taking in a multiple offer situation in order to entice a seller to choose their offer over another buyer's offer. And one of the strategies that a lot of buyers are using is what we lovingly refer to as the appraisal gap stipulation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is, and then stay tuned to the end, and I'm going to give you a unique twist on this that might just be the ticket. So basically what this is saying is, in an offer, when a buyer makes an offer to a seller or the parties go binding on a contract, if there is what we refer to as an appraisal gap stipulation, then in essence what that says, how the buyer is enticing or trying to entice the seller to take their offer over a competing offer, the buyer says, look, if the property appraises, we still negotiate and agree upon a sale price. However, if the appraisal of the property comes in less than the negotiated binding sale price, then at closing, I agree to bring cash for the difference between the low appraisal and the sale price. So, couple of things. I'm gonna keep this one short. I've done other videos on the appraisal gap contingency, but a couple of things to remind you of. Without an appraisal gap stipulation, any buyer is always welcome to bring cash for the difference between a low appraisal and the contract sale price. You do not need a stipulation for the buyer to choose to do this. Again, this is just a method, a strategy for a buyer to communicate that up front to entice a seller to take their offer over a competitive offer, multiple offer at the same time, simultaneous competitive offer. That's point number one. Point number two is, if the buyer is getting an FHA insured loan or a VA insured loan, regardless of any stipulation, it's a moot point. A buyer may terminate the contract. If they're getting an FHA or VA insured buyer, they may send notice of termination prior to the closing date, prior to 11:59 p.m. on the closing date, unless the stipulation has written regarding the closing date, and terminate, and they will get their earnest money back. An FHA and VA buyers' earnest money is protected on a low appraisal regardless of any special stipulation. You cannot agree in writing to something that is a violation of federal regulation. And the amendatory clause for an FHA insured buyer or a VA insured buyer is a federal regulation that you cannot agree to override that. That federal regulation, the amendatory clause, shall prevail. Done another whole video tip on that, but that was the summary of that. So this all comes into play, in essence, with a conventional loan. Now, the thing you have to remember, and a lot of buyers and buyers agents get hooked up on this, if there is an appraisal gap stipulation where the buyer agrees to bring X amount of dollars over a low appraisal, not to exceed the contract sale price, number one, you need to add in there not to exceed the contract sale price, or you're obligating your buyer to bring X amount of dollars over appraisal regardless. The issue comes in, the issue comes in, what if there's still a gap? What happens if the contract sale price is here, the appraisal is here, after the buyer's agreement to bring additional cash from the low appraisal, we're still here. We're still short. What happens? You guys, a seller is not obligated to come down in sale price. A seller is obligated to sell the property at the contract price they agreed, which is up here. So an appraisal gap stipulation is only a buyer obligation in a conventional loan to bring additional cash. You also need to check with the lender. We do have a couple of appraisal gap stipulations written for us by attorneys, because what happens if there's a gap? If the buyer's agreement to bring additional funds is still short of the contract sale price, termination rights, so forth and so on. So one appraisal gap stipulation that we have authored for us by Amee Davis of Davis and Associates accounts for this, accounts for termination rights for a buyer or renegotiation by making a reference back to the original conventional loan contingency in the contract. And it states, all parties hereby acknowledge that any appraisal contingency is hereby amended to reflect the following terms. If any appraisal is for less than the purchase price, buyer shall be responsible to deliver any additional funds needed for closing to satisfy the difference between the low appraised value and the agreed upon purchase price of the property, up to an amount not to exceed blank, and that is now called the variance. Any difference in appraised value and the purchase price that is equal to or lesser than the variance will not be grounds to terminate this agreement. However, if the difference in the appraised value and the purchase price is greater than the variance, in other words, if there's still a gap, then the buyer is subject to the terms outlined in the appraisal contingency clause of this agreement and has the right but not the obligation to terminate this agreement without penalty. Buyer will have 3 days from receipt of notice of appraised value resulting in the variance being greater than the variance agreed upon herein to terminate. If buyer does not terminate within 3 days, then the buyer shall be deemed to waive the right to terminate and bring even more additional funds to the above the original variance value to close. Stipulation, if conflicting with any exhibit, addendum, or preceding paragraph, shall control. There's another one authored by Seth Weissman. In the event the property does not appraise for at least purchase price, buyer agrees to pay seller at closing the difference between the sale price and the appraised value in cash, and not use the failure of the property to appraise as the basis to either terminate or ask for a reduction in the sale price. Notwithstanding the above, if the difference between the sale price and the appraised value is more than X amount of dollars, buyer shall have the right but not the obligation to terminate the agreement, provided that the buyer does give notice to the seller within X number of days of receiving the appraisal of the property, in which case buyer shall be entitled to return of buyer's earnest money. If buyer does not terminate the agreement within the time frame, buyer's right to terminate on this basis shall be waived, and buyer shall pay cash to seller at time of closing for the entire difference, the appraised value and the sale price. So, again, those are great and provide for termination rights if there is more of a gap between the low appraisal and the contract sale price other than what the buyer initially stated they would bring. So, y'all ready for a unique way to handle this that hopefully is a win-win for everybody? Now, you're going to have to check with your buyer. You're going to have to check with your lender. And it is going to be dependent upon the sale price of the home. And you listing agents, you're going to have to check with your seller. But consider something to the effect of buyer and you have a contract sale price, and that's the sale price. And then you put in some sort of stipulation that in essence states, if the appraisal of the property comes in lower than the contract sale price, then buyer agrees to pay 10% of that value in cash at closing to bring cash for the difference for 10% above, and the seller agrees to sell if that value is 10% below the contract sale price. Now, that's not the actual wording of the special stipulation because you need terms of notice and termination rights, so forth and so on. But I just want to give you some sort of construct or an idea where a buyer is going to bring cash for the difference, but up to a certain amount, a percentage of the low appraisal, and the seller up front agrees to come down from the contract sale price within a certain tolerance level if the appraisal comes in low. Now, you're going to have to put some stop gaps in there for a certain low appraisal to make it work for the buyer and for the seller. But if that is something that the parties like, again, depends upon, you're going to want to put in stopgaps. You're still going to want to put in termination rights if the appraisal is lower than a certain percentage that the buyer's willing to take, a lender's willing to allow, and a seller is willing to take. But my point is try and address a seller's reduction as well as a buyer bringing cash for the difference in one fell swoop up front when you are negotiating a contract. So as with any special stipulation, please run any special stipulations by your broker prior to using, and you definitely want to run them by a closing attorney as well. But you're going to need some sort of stopgaps as well as termination rights built in, and what happens to the earnest money. Just wanted to put that out there and hope you guys like that contract tip. Let me know your thoughts below. What's been going on with appraisals for y'all lately? Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.